It is such an adventure to read all of your poems, your Dadaist poems. They're amazing. I love every one of them. I'm just singling out here just one, even though I'd like to read them all together. Jan Pauline Agawin writing a Tristan Zara poem that begins, "They killed upwards of 1 million persons in battle. It was an absurd and self-defeating aim which ruined both victors and vanquished. It also celebrated violence, masculinity, and the aggression of modern speed. Everything which we loved was lost. Let them at least have a memorial in this little note. In my desperate attempt to free art, I took refuge in the square form and exhibited a picture which consisted of nothing more than a black square on a white field. How much can be stripped away before an object's status as art disappears?" And it's particularly great that we get the poem in its strips of printed out paper on the composition book with all of these other elements of paper, adding another layer of collage. I love that. This great poem gives us the tone, the feeling, the spirit, what is called in art history the Zeitgeist, the Weltanschauung is what I mean to say, the worldview of the time, and the time is called the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. It's as if it's captured in these words, which is pretty powerful that this method could do that, because you've seen how this time was so horrific and yet so creative. Gina and other folks were asking how Dada broke out in so many places. Was this sort of a universal reaction? I thought that was a nice way of putting it, as if sort of everyone moved by the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, is reacting in this way, or do we have one person kind of transmitting it? In a way, it's a little bit of both. We have a cluster of people first in Zurich, and then artists are really traveling quite a bit. Despite the war, Europe is a pretty closely knit geography, and artists were habitually going to other art capitals out of curiosity. And many were traveling from Europe to the United States to seed Dada in New York as well. And so they were bringing the idea with them. Karina made a great point about history isn't always one-sided, and that she means by that these horrifying events are going on. It's a terrible century, as Hobsbawm was explaining, and yet there are these scientific technologies, and there are women gaining political emancipation, and then there are the civil rights. So it is very important, I think, reading these rich texts like Hobsbawm's to get a feeling for how history is never totally black and white. Even when it is in its darkest days. We tend to, in our minds, to sort of separate things into all one or all the other. And it's very important to embrace the contradictions that coexist. Alia, in addition to a fantastic poem, has some really great questions. Were Dada artists making a living off their art, or were these more just personal political projects? They were independent personal political projects. There really was no market for this. A lot of them were lucky beneficiaries, though, of certain patrons, certain very wealthy, progressive-minded people who were interested in the arts that were willing to really subsidize them in the making of their art. One of the most influential, the most famous, was Peggy Guggenheim, who inherited a bunch of money when her dad drowned in the Titanic sinking in 1912. And she was completely fascinated by art and absolutely interested in avant-gardes, and essentially brought a great deal of the European avant-garde to New York and was the founder of the Guggenheim Museum. She was very influential for Duchamp, giving Duchamp a place to stay, giving him funds so he could do his wonderful, wicked Dada games, such as what Alia is talking about, Fountain. And I think that Alia has given us this amazing second Dada poem about her 7-year-old self and her dad and trying to figure out what this fountain is all about. So this can actually be seen at SF MoMA, and you are going to be, in the next few days, getting your final project assignment, which is going to be about going to a museum. One of your options will be SF MoMA. So, for instance, Alia, could you do our 1917, The Fountain? And I think that Duchamp would love to have this great poem, Do Boys Stand Up When They Poop? I really think that it would be amazing Dada action to go to the museum and like stick that poem on the pedestal next to it. Okay, that's not an official dare. I shouldn't say that. I'm a teacher. So Wingday X asks this very big question. Why has Dadaism been so famous? I mean, it's hard to answer such big questions, right? Because there are really so many things going into the reason why. But certainly one is that Dada explodes conventions. Human beings are conventional thinkers. We're creatures of habit. We rely on conventions. You drive on the right side of the road, unless you're in Britain. You don't even think about driving on the left side of the road. That's a convention. It could go the other way. The purpose of the convention is so that you don't think. You just drive along on the right side of the road. You know, you wear your pants on your legs and you don't wear them on your head. That's another convention. What Dadaism does is it explodes the kind of shell of convention that keeps consciousness in a tidy, small space and opens it up to the vastness, the wildness, and the uncertainty of reality. So Dadaists like Hannah Höch are opening up the idea that reality is something more disturbing, more elusive, more enigmatic, more puzzling than our conventions would allow us to believe. Conventions exist to simplify things, to make life easier. But this idea of reality as full of these confusing mixtures of mechanical and bodily parts, of things that are attractive and frightening, this seemed far more true in the era of World War I, when people confronted the horrifying reality of mass death, when reality seemed like something you couldn't take for granted and be numb about. And some folks had interesting comparisons in their conversation to today with COVID, and the idea that we are also in a time where the way Maya put it is we can't have the escapism of conventional thinking. And that's disturbing. It's exciting, but it's disturbing. And so turning to Hobsbawm for a minute, there was this quotation from the great Italian writer and concentration camp survivor Primo Levi. And I seeded a question about the Gordon, and Devin had this very deep and thoughtful response, where he's talking about the limbo of the Jewish people in the concentration camp and that incredibly vulnerable perspective of being so close to the direct horrors that he was incapable of even perceiving it. And there is an idea in philosophy that reality in its entirety is something we are incapable of perceiving. And Primo Levi is definitely saying that the reality of death and terror in those camps was something that could not be perceived. So let's look back to where we began. Caravaggio. Here's his painting of Medusa, the Gorgon. She is the Gorgon because she is so terrifying of a monster with her head of snakes that she cannot be looked at directly. That is the Greek myth. The idea is that anyone who attempts to look at her will turn to stone, will be frozen, lifeless, unable to speak, unable to move. Perseus slays her, that's why the blood is dripping from her decapitated head, because he does not look at her directly. He uses his shield and looks at her in the mirror. And so there is this idea in philosophy that we cannot look directly at the complexity of reality or what World War I meant. And one of the things art does is it's like Perseus's shield. It reflects that which is too much to take in, too much to bear, and it allows us to look.